Thank you so much for that introduction. Aloha mai kako. It's so nice to meet you all and to be here. It's really rare for me to be in a space with this many Pacific Islanders. So I'm just feeling really overwhelmed with my mana and just very humbled to be here with you all. And it definitely does ease some anxiety and nerves, which is nice. So before we start, I do want to acknowledge that where I'm at, which is currently in Logan, Utah, I'm up at Utah State University. I want to acknowledge that Utah State University and all in-state USU institutions reside on the original territory of the 8 federally recognized tribes of Utah, tribes that have been living, working, and residing on this land from time immemorial. I want to acknowledge the painful history and genocide forced removal from this land has made, and honor and respect the Indigenous peoples still connected to the land on which we all exist. I want to also acknowledge my ancestors and my kupuna and those who have come before me, who I believe generationally exist within me and who will come after me too. And I also want to acknowledge that research has historically been used to perpetuate oppression through ontological, epistemological, utilitarian, and ethical applications of Eurocentrism for Indigenous peoples. And for me, as an Indigenous scholar, it's important to acknowledge the way research has impacted Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, and to intentionally be mindful of kuleana for cultural traditional Oiwi methodologies. So with that being said, I am Melissa Leilani Devencenzi. I'm Kanaka Maoli, Native Hawaiian. I come from a long lineage of ohana from Hawaii Island and Oahu. I grew up in California, actually, so Southern California. I know there's lots of folks from California here today. I attended Chaminade University of Honolulu for undergrad. I have my master's in marriage and family therapy, and my doctorate is in counseling psychology. My research has focused on the impact of culture and gender identity for the well-being of Native Hawaiian males post-colonization, which we'll get to later. I currently work at Utah State University's Counseling Center as a doctoral intern, where I provide individual group therapy, supervision, assessment, and outreach. And I work pretty closely with the Native American folks here on campus and looking at their mental health and well-being. And I've also spent much of my professional life decolonizing myself and my identity and trying to understand how to decolonize my views of the mental health field, which I hope to share with you all as well. So just info about me, I consider myself a collectivist and a community person more than I do a professional. So that means for me, I'm Kanaka first, and I'm a guide to walk with people along their mental health journey, and that I do not intend to tell people what to do or to be the end all be all. Before going into my presentation, I want to acknowledge that every Pacific Islander culture is different. Our cultural backgrounds and experiences are different, and likewise our healing may look different. So just keep that in mind as well, because my Indigenous standpoint has been impacted by my Kanaka Maoli identity. And then lastly, I also want to acknowledge that throughout the presentation, I do use the words Kanaka Maoli, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders, Indigenous people, somewhat interchangeably, but you will know when it's meant to be specific versus broad as well. And I think that people have different meanings for those words, and that's okay too. So just mahalo piha for inviting me and allowing me to be here to share some time with you all and to provide my ike and mo'olelo. So going into this, I just thought it would be nice to share some of my hopes here, because I think hopefulness is a really important piece of mental health for me. And my hope here is just to guide folks to learn something new. And if it isn't new, to solidify what you may already know and why it's important. I first want to reflect on our identities, hopefully together. But if you just want to drop stuff in the chat, that's fine too. And then I want to discuss research and why this topic is important, and I will share results from my own research as well. And then lastly, I want to end with future strides regarding the importance of an Indigenous perspective in the mental health field. I do have a lot of information to share, so feel free to stop me at any time if I'm going over time. All right, so when I think about the topic of this conference, I think a lot about the detrimental effect that lack of awareness, misinformation, cultural appropriation, lack of space and silence has for Pacific Islanders that are contributing factors to Pacific racism and violence. And I also think a lot about the deeper meaning of this quote that I have pulled up. And this is one of my favorite quotes by a Kanaka Maoli scholar that I find to be particularly powerful when thinking about Native and Pacific Islander identity. And I want to take a minute just to read it and to reflect. So it says, "What a fascinating thing life is. I have survived the many, many stories of how I think, what I know, and who I am, all told by those who are well-meaning, well-dressed, and well-ignorant of the deeper sides of my cultural epistemology. It's a telling that has captured more than my imagination. It has, instead, held me hostage to ideas and philosophies I have had no hand in forming, and thus I feel no real stake in its potential to inspire." And so when I think about this quote, I think a lot about misinformation and the lack of historical representation that's shared about Pacific Islanders. And I just want to open this up quickly to see if anyone has any responses or reactions to this. I'm not sure if folks want to go off mute, but if they do, definitely feel free. But if you'd like to drop something in the chat, that's fine too. I'll just hold space for a minute. Yeah, I can repeat what I asked, no problem. So I am just wondering if this quote, if anyone has any like reactions to it, does it bring up anything for you? So for instance, when I read this quote, I think about how a lot of folks growing up for me had no idea what Pacific Islanders were or who Native Hawaiians were. I was raised in an area where I think my family was the only Native Hawaiian family, and we had one other Samoan family in my town. And so it was a lot of lack of representation there. And so I was just wondering if anyone had any similar reactions or thoughts.
If I may share, for me, what's coming up is I'm from Mexico. And we were colonized. And I was born and raised in Mexico. And what's interesting is that I felt very proud of my Mexican culture when I moved here, but it was until I moved here that I started to notice the genocide that happened to the Aztecs and the Mayans. And that was something I didn't learn in Mexico. We were just still the education, right? Talking about Columbus, and all these people who colonized us and killed all of our people. So that's really sad.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for sharing that, Martha. I do think that those areas are particularly painful. And I think that that is definitely something that impacts well-being and impacts one's, sense of self and attachment to culture or cultural values too. Okay, I'll move on, but I'm glad y'all got a chance to reflect. So in this version, let's see, there is one more chat. Mm-hmm. The story is silence, so I had to search for my culture. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I felt like that as well too. And I think it does take some of us to be trailblazers to get into that space. And so with that, I want to share a little bit about myself and my views, just so that you feel like you know me a little bit more and it's not just a stranger here to present, because I feel kind of icky when you're not allowed to actually know the person as a person. Because I know for myself, my identity plays a significant role in my work as a therapist and researcher and professional. And so when I think about my identity and how it's informed and shaped the work that I've done and that I plan to continue to do, I think about it as a constant. So to me, mental health is about holistic wellness and healing, and that's absolutely shaped by my Indigenous background. And I heard a Native woman share this once, and I do strongly believe it. She said, "All of us here today who identify as Indigenous or Native to our communities are hope made flesh. We are all the resistance. We are the resilient, born into this world, a victory against colonialism." And when I reflect on holding this identity in the mental health field, I'm struck by the need for us to look at a strengths and resiliencies-based perspective instead of just deficits or pathology. And so for me, I view the self as a guide and a conduit, and there's no detachment among my indigeneity, myself, my work as a therapist or researcher, because I believe that my ancestors have guided me here, and that separating these things goes against my ea, or sovereignty, and my worldviews and values. And I think that to understand all of that, we must also understand ourselves and how we are inseparable from these things. And as we get more into discussing research and mental health strides for Pacific Islanders, I think it will support my belief that due to minimization of Indigenous peoples in the mental health and psychology field, bringing ourselves in needs to happen. And so Pacific Islander representation is important. Much like the quote I shared before in my first slide, I've also gone through stages of feeling deep sadness because of folks making assumptions about my background, wanting to quantify my level of indigeneity, deciding if they think I am Native Hawaiian enough, about my fair skin, about imposing upon my cultural values and my own self-sovereignty. And I've definitely wondered what my potential to inspire other folks would be. And I think it is hard if you don't have a mentor within any field who is representative of your Pacific Islander identity. And so through this time, I found myself looking more and more discouraged as I was writing my dissertation and looking for any piece of research done with Native Hawaiian individuals that studied their well-being in relation to their identity. And I think due to that literature gap, there is a need to continue to bridge that space among Pacific Islanders and their identity and mental health. But to be honest, I was totally scared because my thought process was like, what if I get this wrong? What if no one else does this and I get this wrong and then everyone is upset with me? And I think that thought process is exactly what we need to work towards to heal among other Indigenous and Pacific Islander folks. And so for me, I strongly believe that I got where I am today because of mentorship, because of my ancestors and steadfastness in cultural values. And though I've not had a Pacific Islander mentor, I did have a mentor that urged me to look within myself and do the decolonizing work that was needed so that I could feel like it was okay for me to explore this topic and this aspect of practice and research due to my connection with it and its need in the mental health field. And I do think that if we have more Pacific Islander mentors out there, or even mentors willing to be allies and not the leaders, and to give grace and hope to students, that we can increase representation in fields across the board. And so with values, knowing my identity and my cultural values has been really important for me when carrying it over to my work. So identifying the level to which I feel harmony when values are practiced together and noticing what brings disharmony to them, such as conflicts among my own Native Hawaiian values and Western values. And so for me, a lot of this looks like love, compassion and mercy, humility, patience and grace, family, relatives, ancestors, future descendants. It looks like respect for our family, that is the land and the earth. It looks like respect for physical land, which incorporates our bodies, our environment, our birth land, landmarks, mountain, the sea. It looks like respect for psychological aina, or land, and its interconnectedness with the psychological or emotional land that is our thoughts and feelings that we hold. And so the idea that there is potential for resilience and for growth despite being through adverse experiences. It also looks like being rooted in the idea that knowing our physical land enhances one's being, their self-esteem, their self-identity, and their connection with their ancestors. And then also spiritual aina, so our relationships with the spiritual world and with the sacred, and how does that lift and move us and rejuvenate us. Within my values, so to be in harmony, all must coexist with each other and one another, and again, are inseparable. And then when I think about decolonizing in that section below, and decolonizing myself in my studies, it requires identifying what it means to be of mixed ancestry for myself, identifying what it means to be Native Hawaiian and what is considered the United States when many of our people do not consider themselves to be a citizen of this nation due to illegal occupation, annexation, and overthrow. And for those of us here who understand the pains of colonialism, like Martha was sharing earlier, I think the aim of decolonizing ourselves and our work means to awaken and to heal to the ways that we've been numb to the pain of colonization and all of the pain that it has inflicted, and the ways that we have been harmfully conditioned, and the ways in which we have been indoctrinated by the colonial and imperialist patriarchy, either to oppress, to be oppressed, or both. And it's about emotional work involved in unpacking our ancestral load and the present day patterns that are associated with some of these stories of our Indigenous heritage and peoples. And it's about how we move and engage with the land, to the animals, and to one another's pain, because again, I think as a community, we're inseparable. And so for me, it's important to continue to mentor and aid and build up and focus on resiliencies and strengths, perseverance, stories, tradition, and how we can overlap that into the now. And so I have a small exercise if folks can read this. And if you don't want to engage, totally fine. But if you do, I will still hold space and you can drop stuff in the chat or unmute. But I like to start off by spending a few minutes doing consciousness raising reflection about identity, what we know, and how we know what we know. Because for me, consciousness raising and reflection are important parts of mental health, as it allows us to explore and examine the stories that we've been told and internalized, where we receive the information and how it is perpetuated. And then we'll talk about it afterwards if folks are up for it. So I'll read the poem and then I want folks to reflect. And here is the poem. So this poem says, thinking about Hawaiian identity, I start to spin in circles easily. Is identity belonging, or is belonging identity? Do I meet the criteria, a certain textbook definition, or is being Hawaiian my inheritance and from my ancestors unconditionally given? Full, half, quarter, or eighth, it doesn't take long for the experts to proclaim Hawaiians are indeed a vanishing race. Influenza, VD, and now we've contracted US racial rhetoric that grounds us down to mere fractions. When my blood is measured and my features dissected, I start to feel sick as if infected. By reason and logic, by science and politics, all my life I have swallowed this blood quantum theory, like pills from the colonial pharmacy. Prescription strength invisibility to cure this illness of lingering indigeneity. Hawaii is paradise, up for grabs, full of aloha and hula dance, an image of smiling natives that everyone would love to be. The only obstacle that complicates is the call to discriminate for the sake of sovereignty. Self-determination fueled by genealogical identity, Hawaiian entitlement to be free from the thick of American fantasy. And so I know that this is Hawaiian identity specific because it is by a Kanaka Maoli scholar, but I do think that questioning of identity can be common for some Pacific Islanders, especially for folks in the Pacific who are impacted by colonization. And so I do want folks to reflect and just spend a little bit of time for my Pacific Islanders here today. How does this poem resonate with you? How did you learn about your culture, about your racial or ethnic backgrounds, and where did your ike, your knowledge, come from? And then I also am wondering, and you don't have to share this with me, but maybe just to yourself, what emotions or feelings come up for you when you think about how others have quantified identity for us? And if you're here and not Pacific Islander, I do want you to reflect on the history of Pacific Islanders that you were taught in school. As well as the depictions you saw growing up of these cultures. And maybe you recall that the culture was told in past tense, as if it's not something that's still active today, or maybe you recall that it was primarily focused on deficits. And so I just want folks to reflect on that too. And I'll just set a little timer for myself for about, I don't know, 2 or 3 minutes. And you can drop stuff in the chat, you can unmute, you can keep it to yourself, whatever feels best. And I'll hold about 30 more seconds. Okay. I'm just going to read the chat. I definitely agree with a lot of what you're saying, the blood quantum theory. It definitely hits hard, and the difference among, I guess, the perceived belief of what blood quantum theory symbolizes for other people, and how it's used to just kind of quantify things for us. Susie, I totally agree with what you're saying. Do I meet the criteria? We've contracted US racial rhetoric, and my blood is compared to the way I look. I feel very similarly. I think for me and within my family, it's been a lot of acknowledging being part oppressor and part oppressed, right? Because I do hold white and Kanaka Maoli identity, and I think that that's been a really tough pill for me to swallow for a really long time, and knowing that, you know, part of me did not want the other part of me too.
Melissa, if I can share too,
Yeah.
when you had expressed about like, when did I first start learning about the history of my Pacific Islander relatives, I was shocked to just reflect that it wasn't until college where I learned that Hawaii was colonized and all of these different islands had their own systems, their own kings and queens, and it was just like it it was just so, it made me so angry that it wasn't until college where we learned these things. And you know, throughout a K through 12 system, it's nothing but joy, like, oh yeah, like they were friendly and they wanted us to come here, and that's not the true story and the true narrative of it. And I think that's how we, I don't know, I think these types of conferences are just so powerful, and being able to have Pacific Islander students in my classrooms and learn with them and learn from their experiences were so powerful, because that trauma aspect was never pinpointed until college. And I see a lot of that anger and a lot of that sadness just even within the chat. And so I just wanted to share that reflection that I had.
Thank you for sharing that. I feel very similarly, and I agree with that. I remember feeling really frustrated that accurate history was not shared with me about my culture for other people, in the standard K through 12 situation. And it really was also for me until college, where I was able to kind of learn more or explore more and understand more. And I definitely agree with a lot of what's being said in the chat about, you know, being angry. And I think that we're all at different levels of development regarding our own identity development and our own process of moving through some of this too, especially if you've been impacted by colonialism. And I think sometimes, I know for me, it can be hard to see myself where I'm at, and if my family doesn't match up, it can be painful again as well. And I think taking that anger, kind of what Orita was saying, taking that anger and putting it towards something else, such as helping to heal communities and doing work that's powerful and provides hope, I think that that's also a really beautiful thing to do too. And I just read Vienna's chat too. And learning and examining what it means to be Tongan and trying to separate it from Christianity. Yes, yes. I've definitely been there too. I think all of this is really powerful conversation, and I really appreciate everyone everyone being vulnerable with me, especially here I think it can be kind of hard on Zoom, but I do appreciate it. And I think it's important to acknowledge that everything that everyone is talking about and all of these things regarding like history or lack of acknowledgement or understanding can lead to epistemological violence. And so what that would be is violence in retelling stories that are not accurate, or violence in silencing stories that we hold within our cultural backgrounds. And it does significantly impact the well-being of Pacific Islanders. And so moving into this, I have a short video that I hope will you'll all be able to hear. But I think that this video, one, I love that it's young adults here, so they're kind of like our youth, and they're answering the question about what Pacific Islanders want you to know. And so I would just want to play it for a few minutes.
There's some people who have never heard of the island of Samoa ever. I would give up personally, and I would say, have you heard of Hawaii? It's near there. In reality, it's not near there at all. There's some people who have never heard of the island of Samoa ever. I would give up personally, and I would say, have you heard of Hawaii? It's near there. In reality, it's not near there at all.
Many people think we're just passive people. They often mistake it with being lazy.
Lazy.
Hawaiians being lazy.
And even when I tell them, oh, I'm from Guam, like, you're from Guam? Where's Guam?
I would tell people that I'm Tongan. They would be like, so is that like Hawaiian? Is that like the hula dances and the luau's? And oftentimes I would just have to settle and say that that's close enough.
I think when you say Pacific Islanders, the first thing that comes to most people's minds are big sports stars or big athletes.
We're actually pigeonholed into the athletic category, but I was never one to be really into sports.
I've never played sports, and when I tell them that, they insist that I should play sports because that's going to be a waste of height, and it's in my genes.
I've been called flying Hawaiian, or I'll be asked do the haka, which is not really a Samoan thing.
They insist they know more about myself than I actually do know about myself.
Hawaii was illegally annexed to the United States. A bunch of American businessmen wanted to have access to the land, and they got the support of the US Navy, and they basically told the Queen, you can let us have rights to your land, or we can fire on you and destroy you.
We are citizens of the United States. Although people back on the islands don't get to vote for president, we are some of the small group of citizens in the United States that don't actually have presidential voting rights.
And I distinctly remember asking my professor, it was the first year of school, did the syllabus, and it was the upper division course, like the last part of your Asian American Studies class, and I asked him, are we ever gonna learn about Pacific Islanders? And he was like, well, unfortunately there isn't a professor who can talk about Pacific Islanders. We won't be able to highlight that. And I was just really upset. And I remember just feeling like I'm gonna self-teach myself if I have to. I'm gonna look at schools that have Pacific Islander studies and teach myself about myself. And that's like the one hardest thing I had to do.
Growing up, seeing things on TV, Hawaiians weren't really portrayed in such a positive way.
And then when they think of Islanders, they always think of like hula dancers or Lilo and Stitch type characters.
Tikis and hula dancing, the wrong kind of hula dancing.
It's tough growing up as a Pacific Islander and maybe feeling that you don't fit into those things that are presented in mainstream media.
The roles I would go out for would be like accented English, foreign exchange student, Harajuku girl, or like a prostitute.
What are some strong values within your cultures?
Oh yes, family is number one.
We always look after one another.
Sometimes I feel like nothing else matters in the world. All that matters is if we have each other.
All my cousins, we all consider each other brother and sisters. And even if people call us like, hey, that's your cousin, like, no, that's my brother.
We always want to feed everybody.
A lot of humility is rooted in being Pacific Islander in general.
Stories are so important, and we would hear from my grandparents and their generation all the stories from when they were growing up. And especially for people from the Mariana Islands, stories typically involve war. And the impact that World War II had on the islands and on our grandparents' generation as they were growing up. My grandmother, when she was 16 years old, was put into a camp. She found out that she was going to be killed, and she fled with her siblings all down to age 2 into a cave where she lived for 18 months. She collected coconuts for water, and she told us how you could make clothing out of coconuts, how you could literally survive off of the coconut.
I actually myself took like a touristy like canoe paddling trip with my dad, where we like paddle canoe for a couple hours with this guy who was a guide. He was saying, you know, the native population was wiped out, was just decimated by Captain Cook and like British and American sailors, because Hawaiians were not immune to those diseases. Because of that and because of our dwindling numbers, like the Hawaiian race is going to disappear. I just felt such sadness and loss that like our people and our culture will disappear. Oh my God, it's making me emotional just thinking about it. It's very sad. It's very sad when you know that your people are going to fade into time and history.
Take into account, we are real people, we're tangible. We're not your island destination for a getaway.
We have a culture that is different from many others around the world, and we have kind of our unique place in the middle of the Pacific.
Hawaii is really special. The land is alive, it is old, it's really powerful. It's just very special knowing that you have a connection to that.
If you don't know, ask. Don't just assume.
More people are here. We're a small group, but we are absolutely here.
Especially with our Pacific Islander people. It's okay to struggle. We all struggle, especially as minorities within a minority. You just have to push through.
Okay. So I think that this is a good place to kind of bring the identity discussion full circle. And I really appreciate the feeling of community and the respect for culture and the want for other people to understand it that comes from this. I love the takeaway message here too, which is that it's okay to struggle. But I think so often we feel like we have to push things down or deny it because mental health can be scary and some kind of taboo too. All right, so going into the research, when I reflect on my academic experiences, I remember looking through academic literature and being disappointed by the lack of psychological research conducted with Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. And I do strongly believe that there's a huge paucity in the literature that exists, and that is the impact that Western gender norms have had after colonization on Native Hawaiian adolescents and young adults' identity and well-being. And I think here the term well-being is so important because it does include anti-violence, right? So if you do feel as though you have access to coping strategies and to resources, it does serve as a bolster against some of that. And when thinking about the history that exists intergenerationally for Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islander folks, examining identity for the resilient populations is important. And so I chose to focus on youth males for twofold. And the first is that I've been significantly influenced by my own kupuna, specifically my grandfather, who taught me much of what I know and who I am and what that means to me. And I remember when I went to Chaminade that I would live with him on the weekends and just, talk story with him and learn about beading and learn about all of the different crafts because he was a craftsman. And that was a significantly important part of my life. And then the other part is that at this time of this study, there was a lot of research and information coming out regarding this concept of hegemonic masculinity, which we'll talk about later, and buzzwords such as toxic masculinity. And I reflected on that and thought, like, how incongruent with culture, and what does that mean for us, for people to say those words generalizably? And so thinking about the traits of stereotypic masculinity as identified by Western norms, it would be anti-femininity, it would be stoicism, it would be not discussing emotions, it would be aggressiveness. And I was interested in how some of these more Western ideas translated into Hawaiian culture, where I know from research male identities were more impacted emotionally. And I want to acknowledge that I do identify as wahine, and I do not claim to know everything about masculinity or kane. But what I do want to do is to continue to add strengths-based information into this research because I think that that's important. And as a disclaimer, I do discuss masculine youth identity in the beginning, but we will also touch more on broad concepts for all genders regarding well-being and regarding like therapeutic treatment going forward. And I also want to share that this is important to acknowledge the past and where we have come from so we can know where we need to go. It's kind of hard because I think that those are inseparable. And while I do prefer to take a strengths-based approach, there's no denying the negative impact colonialism has had on Native Hawaiians and many Pacific Islanders too. And so looking at the need for a focus within the psychology realm, colonization is a gendered process that has gendered and eroticized Hawaiian culture, separating genders for marketing and tourism purposes. In pre-colonization, while Americans utilized gender roles, Hawaiians relied on genealogical rank, kapu, and social norms. And similarly, Hawaiians relied on balance or pono among dichotomous forces, which includes, light and dark, land and sea, male and female energy. And the mana among men and women were harmoniously balanced within Hawaiian epistemologies as critical forces for well-being. And it does, looking through the literature, it does appear that it was not until colonization that foreign ideologies of things like sexism and misogyny became introduced and were really impacted. And I think that this is also true and important when we think about genders as a whole, right? So not just the polarity of male or female, but also about mahu, especially as it relates to comparison within Western stigma and stereotype. Taikavi Katengan explained that a result of colonization on gender, culture, and race, many Native Hawaiian kane may feel detached and emasculated without direction or place in society. And so because of this, there's a huge need to increase representation of Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders within psychology through research, through treatment, through culturally appropriate practices, and through clinical modalities. Within this field specifically, there have been minimal studies that have conducted to explore the extent in which colonization and Western gender norms influence Native Hawaiian men's identity and well-being. And so as we know, culture is a protective factor. So positive cultural beliefs are protective factors, and connection to one's identity may prove to aid against the negative impact of Western ideals. Culture can also prove as a buffer against violence and against some of these more negative things that we're trying to prevent. And when we discuss protective factors, it really means the opposite of risk factors. So broadly, protective factors are characteristics at the biological, the psychological, the familial, or community, including peers or culture, level that is associated with the lower likelihood of problem outcomes, or that reduces the negative impact of a risk factor on a problem. So for instance, like violence. And so just broadly, I think it's important to first understand why there could be a need to look at the Western gender roles and what they may have impacted for Native Hawaiians. And so just doing a quick lit review within the masculinity research. Research shows that one's gender identity materializes in early childhood. So it generally takes place at a young age and can be influenced by the same sex parents or opposite sex parents, depending on who's available, as well as relatives or role models. It's also theorized that socially masculinity is precarious and needs to be constantly appraised, and this could be potentially through traditional masculine stereotypes or traits. And so here's that term again, hegemonic masculinity. It's the belief that men in dominant power support superiority over women and other non-powerful men. And it is largely a Western concept. And so within Native Hawaiian culture, this term is pretty different because pre-colonization, this term did not exist in this way. But Taikavi Katengan does touch on this a little bit regarding Native Hawaiians and hegemonic masculinity in his academic work, in his book. And if anyone is interested, I can plug that at the end. But for the most part, pre-colonization power was distributed through rank and blood, as discussed before. And then lastly on this slide, research shows that rigid adherence to components that make up this Western term of hegemonic masculinity may lead to masculine gender role stress and aggressive behavior, anti-femininity, dominance over women, homophobia, and stoicism. And research also shows that rigid adherence to this concept for young males may lead to less emotional display, male-to-male in-group bonding that may contribute to gender-based harassment, and negative affect toward effeminate males. And I think that these are all really important within Pacific Islander culture, especially when considering pre-colonization gender identities and how those were viewed. And so within the racial and gender identity research, researchers have found that masculinity, racial socialization, and modeling behaviors are important among minority races. Research on Black males conforming to traditional Western gender norms shows correlations to lower self-esteem and psychological distress. So essentially what it's saying is that as they become more exposed to some of these Western gender norms, it also impacted and provided lower self-esteem and psychological distress for them. And these results were consistent within the literature. However, the literature primarily composes of white males, which is detrimental in this area. And the study was noted to be the first study to examine the impact of males of color exclusively. So you can imagine how few studies there are on Pacific Islander youth and gender identity development as well. And though it is interesting, though, to imagine that despite racial identity, results are consistent across the board. So there may also be some kind of layered effect here related to lower self-esteem and psychological distress that holds a racial component. I think bicultural self-identity is really important. So research on bicultural self-efficacy suggests that being able to hold multiple racial or ethnic identities well can be an indicator of life happiness and well-being. And bicultural identity, that occurs when individuals find themselves living between two or more intersecting cultures. So for instance, for me, Hawaiian and white. And so for other people here, it could be something different as well. And bicultural self-efficacy exists when individuals feel a sense of proficiency in handling the intersecting cultures and functions in a reasonable way. And so now on the flip side, bicultural identity strain would be any strain on one's identity where the different cultures aren't navigated in a way that feels proficient or feels holistic, or when there's tension that exists among identities. And lastly, research consistently shows that racial identity and development on gender identity have impacts on an adolescent's psychological well-being. Within the Native Hawaiian research, the literature identifies the following barriers to positive health for Native Hawaiians as conflicts among cultural values, lack of trust in Western treatment methods, lack of cultural sensitivity in healthcare, lack of access, lack of preventative programs, lack of education, and a lack of understanding Western methods. And research also identifies that Native Hawaiian adolescents and young adults experience significant scholastic, health, and social inequalities. And for youth, the more they perceive themselves to have protective factors, which we'll talk about later too, the greater positive development that they will have. So that is big. Research has shown that modeling behaviors among older adults is beneficial for racial socialization and understanding one's cultural identity and masculinity. So specifically, it is important for young males to identify, what does it mean to be a male within my culture? What were my ancestors like? And also to be able to connect culture and identity and gender identity together. And so furthermore, it's been found that engaging in cultural practices and having high cultural identity for bicultural Native Hawaiians or Pacific Islander folks is an important part of childhood growth because it does act as a buffer against negative health and psychological outcomes. And so at the macro level, well-being for Native Hawaiian males includes a working relationship or connection among the self, family, land, and spirituality in order to achieve lokahi or harmony, and also holding various protective factors. And so these protective factors can include, but they're not limited to, family or community supports, presence of mentors and support for developmental skills and interests, physical and psychological safety, positive norms, academic achievement or mentoring, and good coping skills or problem-solving skills. And so then at the micro level, well-being for Native Hawaiian youth includes connection among spirit, body, thoughts, and feelings. So it incorporates that emotional component as well. Because the Native Hawaiian self-concept is rooted in social connections, a key to optimal well-being is the inseparability of these macro and micro components. And when any micro level component could be out of balance, it does impact well-being. And so this is just a visual representation so that you can see how these researchers viewed it over here in this nice triangle with Akua, Nakanaka, Aina, and the idea is that they would all coexist at the macro level. And then this one is the micro level. So we have Kino, Mana'o, and Uhani, and that would all connect to. And so lastly, cultural trauma, as a lot of people have brought up today, it's been found to contribute to engagement in maladaptive behaviors, psychological distress, and appraisal of perceived discrimination, which may negatively impact self-efficacy, especially if you hold bicultural identities. And therefore, how an individual navigates or holds their cultural identity, especially if they have a multiple dual cultural or racial identity, is really, really important. And so this is something that McCubbin and Marcella have come up with to identify qualities and experiences that may cause disruption among social fabrics and spirituality that leads to disharmony. And this is more like culturally specific, which I think is nice. And I think it's really interesting to go through these and see the difference between many of our cultural worldviews versus a Western worldview. So for instance, what disrupts social fabrics could be hate, jealousy, rudeness, being nosy, bearing a grudge, bragging, showing off, breaking promises, speaking bitter thoughts, stealing, fighting, and hostile behavior. And as we can see towards the end of those cultural ideals that disrupt social fabrics, they are related to violence as well. And it does show that that does create some kind of disharmony or disconnection among cultural identity. And then within the disrupt spirituality would be offended ghosts, natural spirits, spirit guardians, ancestors, elders, black magic or sorcery and curses. And I think the disruption of spiritual fabrics occurs when forces come into play with an individual or a family that violates certain taboos or restrictions, thus opening the door for supernatural forces seeking atonement or a sense of calmness to enter their life. And I think if we look at what disrupts spirituality here, and we'll probably talk about this a little bit later, because this does happen within these cultures, if people aren't aware of it, it can be perceived as pathological within a Western worldview. And so considering all of that information that I kind of just threw at all of you, it really made me recognize that there are a lot of gaps that need to be filled here. And so I was curious, what impacts do the relationships among cultural identity, gender-based perceptions, and endorsement of Western masculine gender roles have on Native Hawaiian males' well-being and cultural identity? And I set out to explore 3 different hypotheses for my dissertation. And the first question was, if cultural affiliation was indeed positively associated with well-being, what would that look like? And so that would mean, does culture actually prove to be a protective factor for these adolescent young adult males? And then the next question is, if engaging in any of the previously mentioned stereotypical Western masculine norms would impact well-being or cultural affiliation. So for instance, does the gendered impact of colonization actually affect some of our youth or some of our young adults? And then the last question, if there was any relationship among cultural affiliation, androgyny, well-being, and stereotyped gender norms brought on by colonization. And this part was important for me, and it was pretty exploratory just because I was wondering, has the gendered impact of colonization impacted any views on androgyny or folks who we know hold both gendered energy, both masculine and feminine, and maybe mahu? And so within my research, I utilized 4 surveys to assess for cultural and gender identity, acceptance of androgyny, and relational well-being. My study incorporated 57 participants, and they were recruited throughout email, word of mouth, various colleges, Native Hawaiian civic clubs that I'm a part of, groups, and social media. And the participant criteria required folks to identify as any amount of Native Hawaiian, to be within 18 to 16 years old, and to be male identified individuals, and whatever that looks like for them, just so long as they identify as male. Looking at the map, 77% of participants came from Hawaii, and 22% came from what is now known as the contiguous United States. When I think about my study, it only adds a really tiny bit to the research and the literature, but I do think it adds a lot of bit in how we think about conceptualizing treatment for Pacific Islanders as a whole. And so this is really the only relevant or salient hypothesis that was found. And so overall, the most salient and supported result in this study highlighted here shows that through a bivariate correlation, cultural affiliation has a positive linear relationship with well-being. And so if you're like me and you're not a big numbers person and you're looking at this like, what the heck, Melissa? Basically what this means is that as one increases, the other increases as well, which I think we all probably could have guessed. That's something that we've all been talking about previously, but I think it is nice to see it in research. And so exploring the results further, I want to share some of the more important takeaways that I've done within this research. And I don't think all are generalizable whatsoever, and that's actually a limitation, but I do think that they are important to consider. And so the first and foremost one is that one's connection with culture can significantly impact well-being, regardless of the impacts of colonization. As it was discussed earlier, this has been seen time and time again in that maintaining cultural engagement and practices have been evidenced to be protective factors in increasing psychological well-being across the lifespan. And we'll talk about the importance of culturally appropriate treatment later. Another important thing to note in my study is that many of my participants, about 51 out of 57, identified as multiracial. And so when thinking about identity, it's important to note that the combination of multiple cultural groups within Hawaii and within the contiguous US and the Pacific is significant, and it could assist healthy psychological adjustment through the ability to manage, absorb, and assimilate different cultural identities, and just to be aware. And there are likely fluctuating degrees of impact that having mixed cultural backgrounds and exposure to larger multi-ethnic communities may have on participants. And so the next one is social desirability. Native Hawaiian masculinity was positively correlated with social desirability, which supports the research regarding Native Hawaiian self-concept being rooted in social connections and is key to optimal well-being. And next, results from my study revealed that masculinity and androgyny were highly correlated with risk-taking, which was interesting because in Hawaiian culture, this can be explained by how Taika Tengen defines Hawaiian masculinity, which is encompassing courage and willingness to fight for the people, manifesting a modern-day warrior chief. Results revealed that cultural affiliation had a negative relationship with power over women, and while masculinity had no relationship with this. And this is also supported by Tengen's identification of historical qualities among Hawaiian masculinities, where he identifies nonviolence to women and children as a central tenet. And this suggests that not everything that fits Western masculinity, such as power over women as formulated within their stereotyped measures, are areas that Native Hawaiians have adapted. And I also think that Native Hawaiian males may identify with masculine descriptors, but these descriptors may take on different concepts. And I think that's where a qualitative study where you just sit down and have a discussion and a conversation would be really helpful. Because, for instance, high masculinity may not mean high endorsement of some of these negative traits or stereotyped negative traits as characterized by Western standards. It could actually mean the opposite. And so regarding one's ability to ask for help, self-reliance had a positive association with age. And I think that this is something to think about regarding how open people are to asking for help from others, and also how important is community or collective environment. In research across the lifespan, they've found that family ethnic schema, barriers to access, and familiarity with the person the individual is speaking to within the healthcare system plays a role in Native Hawaiians' help-seeking behaviors. Likewise, compliance to masculine gender norms as distinguished by both ethnic culture and Western culture contributes to forming an individual's view and patterns of help-seeking. And so it's interesting because our youth, however, may be more likely to engage in help-seeking behaviors than their elders. And when considering the importance of relationship to Native Hawaiians, it is questioned whether the dominant individualistic culture, in contrast to collectivism and incorporation of ohana, contributes to a decrease in well-being. And within this study specifically, it was pretty mind-boggling to see that most of the males shared that they are willing to ask for help or to share their emotions. So I do think that there might be a shift coming down, and that it does take a lot of role modeling in that instance too. And lastly, results showed that androgyny had a positive correlation with masculinity and masculine norms. Even more so, conformity to gender norms displayed a negative West relationship within the feminine traits of participants, suggesting that Western masculine norms do not account for Kanaka Maoli ability to hold masculine, feminine, and androgynous traits. And the way that Native Hawaiians navigate their gender identity is supported by the concepts of pono, which is vastly different from Western gender norms' emphasis on anti-femininity for males. And another explanation may be due to exposure and acceptance of other cultures and practices that endorse varying levels of gender roles, which may result in greater acceptance of non-traditional gender norms too. So this is a whole lot of research talk just to say that cultural identification is important, fostering it is important, having space to practice and acknowledge it is important, and most importantly, having healthy mentors and role models, elders, kupuna, all of them can help to lead to decrease violence and increase pro-social well-being and pro-social behaviors. All right, so now that I talked all of that research at you all, we're now going to go into broadly non-gender specific information. And so thinking about future strides, I think about the need for self-sovereignty of Pacific Islanders in mental health, within mental health. And so for me, self or individual sovereignty is different than what we know as the overall sovereignty or political sovereignty. And I really like Sarah Deer's definition of individual sovereignty. And so she states, an individual has complete control over their lives, bodies, and what people do to them. Inherent power of a person to control and respond to their own internal and external relationships. So when I think about this concept of self-sovereignty within the mental health field, I think it can be violated by folks who do not understand this. And I think that there is an element that needs to be recognized here, that the struggle for the self-sovereignty that many of us feel reflects genocidal patterns and genocidal practices, which have led to historical violation and the compromise of self-determination, disenfranchisement, and connected violation of physical, mental, and spiritual health, all of which coexist to create well-being. And so when I think about this, mental health equity is a goal here. So it requires integrating all aspects of the self with all aspects of the world and is community-based and culturally anchored. And so I believe Pacific Islanders have the right to engage freely in traditional activities and have those incorporated into their mental health care system. And it's viewed as promoting, maintaining, protecting the rich traditional heritage that we Indigenous peoples hold and lifting up the cultural practices and values to their rightful places within the healing process. I think that is absolutely without a doubt needed. And so the idea of returning to whole, I conceptualize this self-sovereignty within the mental health field as bringing our lives back to whole. It's about the individual rights that we have to reuniting with our spiritual self and our mana to bring our life back to whole, reconnecting again with others within our family and community. It's about upholding values placed on meaningful work in this process of healing. This connection of life force with meaningful work gives folks the chance to return to wholeness while adding to other people's well-being too. So this is a collective process across the board. And I think cultural community is essential. So where we can have a community of Pacific Islander peoples for these peoples set up, providing culturally appropriate services that focus on the integration of cultural aspects, as we will discuss later, is really important because this is just a, if not even more so, legitimate practice for Native and Indigenous folks. And so for me, my priorities lie in utilizing my power to advocate for this need, particularly in the efforts to increase emotional well-being, and gain self-determination and sustain the physical, emotional, and spiritual health that we all hold. And I think it's necessary to advocate for change in the views regarding multicultural values and ethical cultural practices by the American Psychological Association to incorporate Pacific Islander worldviews, because I think that that's missing and I think that that's needed. I also think taking a prevention-focused approach and using education and power to resist psychological concepts rooted in colonization is necessary. And so, as discussed before, barriers to mental and physical well-being for Native Hawaiians center on conflicts among culture, lack of trust in Western treatment modalities, lack of cultural sensitivity in healthcare, lack of access, lack of preventative programs, lack of education, and a lack of understanding Western healthcare systems. And similar beliefs are held and they're found throughout the research regarding participating in any form of research study, which I think is understandable, because if someone doesn't understand or acknowledge your cultural values, it makes it really difficult to understand or want to understand them. And so because of this, I think there's a need to work to incorporate our views of healing into the mental health world. So considering these barriers, I see Indigenous knowledge providing a wealth of information for therapists within clinical practice. So the transpersonal, so the mind-body-land relationship among self and others and ancestors before and to come, the spiritual and the sacred connections, the importance of sustainability and how we can increase survival for all, so it's more than just surviving, but thriving, conservation and the importance of respecting land and where we live, increasing cultural sensitivity and the harm that can come from providing culturally inappropriate treatment, acknowledging the importance of cultural values, untangling Western Eurocentric, individualistic, me-centered culture and turning it into a we approach, increasing knowledge of traditional causes of mental disharmony, utilizing stories from our elders and from our other peers, the importance of using a collaborative approach for both therapy and research, so a by and for, by Pacific Islanders, for Pacific Islanders, or a collaborative approach if you aren't Pacific Islander, instead of just an on, where Western views are placed on Pacific Islander peoples. I think representation, so a need for more Pacific Islander psychologists across the board in research, teaching, education, and clinical practice is needed, and the ability to request sessions with a BIPOC clinician or a clinician that will have working knowledge of the client's cultural background is needed. And then lastly, decolonizing mental health, where we can move away from Western versions of therapy and incorporate strengths, culture, and cultural values. And so I think there's a lot of overlap here among Pacific Islanders and different communities, and likewise, many of what I discussed can be shared across different cultures in general and geography. And so when I think about taking the research discussed and moving forward into future strides for mental health healing, I think about how Western and Euro-American psychology can be reductionist, and how some lenses argue that we need to support claims to be warranted. However, this can perpetuate the minimization of cultural views of healing. And so for me, I think it's important to first and foremost know who you are and where you come from. So your racial, your ethnic, your cultural background, and the story that comes with it. It's also important to acknowledge that there is no one-size-fits-all model here. Appropriate and ethical mental health treatment depends on the culture the individual holds. And thinking about history and systems of psychology, the lack of representation of Pacific Islanders here within the psychology realm creates a separation among Western therapy and Indigenous healing. And this is reflected in the history of psychology, where many white male theorists that have utilized epistemological violence to establish primitive races continues to be the dominant theorist in the psychology field. And there is real violence in this. There's real violence in continuing to allow white male theorists to be the dominant narrative in the mental health world. So learning the accurate representation of history is a must. An emphasis on socio-political and historical events that have shaped the lived experiences of Pacific Islanders should be learned. And furthermore, recognizing that culture serves as a protective factor against disharmony is crucial, and this is an often missed component for psychological theories and interventions. And so Western therapy can fall often into the medical model and can be adversarial as it intends to solve or fix so-called problems. In Western culture, when negative emotions come up and seem to be out of nowhere, people view emotions as an indication that something's wrong with them. And this then may lead to medicating, denying, avoiding, which only confuses the unconscious mind. And so only having an emphasis on the psychological and physical aspect of mental health misses the spiritual aspect in that component. So it's important to move away from the deficit model that pathologizes these cultures, because not only do things not all things need to be measured or quantified or explained. So for instance, like I can't imagine how you would try to explain a gut feeling or intuition. Those things just can't really be quantified, or how you can explain how you know what you know by your ancestors. Because here it's less cause and effect and more circular or cyclical. It's important to slow down and to increase intentionality, thoughtfulness, and to be deliberate here. So learning that everything in life is a lesson. What we may be experiencing now will only teach us about who we are and who we might be becoming. Therapy is often holistic and spiritual or nature-based here, and goals may have present orientation with discussion of the past and future goals and incorporation of ohana, aina, and akua, as seen in the traditional native Hawaiian conception of the psyche right here, where things appear to coexist and move throughout. And then also traditional ways involve making a relationship with things. So befriending and transforming instead of fixing and then getting rid of. And many elements in life are looked at as moving energy, such as mental health. And so reflection questions to consider could be, what could you create in your life with the energy that currently is dedicated to holding on what you no longer need or what no longer serves you? And also, how can we live a life that allows others to live meaningfully too? And so the sacred. This is another important aspect for many people and their well-being within Pacific Islands. This transcends the spiritual and the religious, and it acknowledges that everything has an important role in this world. And so all things are sacred: religion, spirituality, relationships, time, land, environment, suffering can even be sacred. And then resiliency and strengths-based. So therapy should be a collaborative process. It should be growth-focused. It should preserve stories. If possible, it should incorporate kupuna, or elders who are proof of resiliency and may serve as a role model for younger generations. It should emphasize lokahi, or balance and harmony, strengths and resiliencies, and if relevant, cultural or ceremonial practices. And cultural values and what leads to disharmony. Many indigenous peoples have values that they follow, so appropriately assessing for the presence of values in one's life could be helpful, because all values help to increase relationships. And then the question is, are they balanced? So what values are present and important to this individual? There's a lot to learn about the connection among the physical, the mental, the spiritual, and the emotional connection, because through all of these things, we are one. So helping to identify different cultural practices that can increase connection among these values can be useful. And then a question to ask could include, how can we live our life in a way that mirrors our values and allows them to impact those we coexist with? And so the importance of life in generations. Many communities believe that life is not linear and that everything is connected. And many believe that people can exist within us and among us without actually being near us. So learning that this is important and necessary to recognize is important, because when we think about intergenerational trauma, transgenerational spirit, or soul wounding and healing of the lineage, we must also take into consideration all of this too. And so regarding diagnosing and assessing, acknowledging the power we have through perpetuating oppression and unethical treatment through diagnosing and assessment is important. So taking the time to learn that what is common within some Pacific Islander cultures may be viewed as pathological under a Western psychology lens, or even within the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual. So things such as seeing things or having visions, talking to spirits, being visited by ancestors, or dreams that may be foreshadowing things. So therapists should ask, research, and identify how are emotions expressed within this particular culture. They should also identify the cultural understanding or the etiology of the symptoms present within the disharmony, which could be vastly different than what Western ideas view or think. And therapists should take into consideration how Indigenous culture may impact the accuracy of diagnosis or assessment. So psychological assessments need to be done and used in a way that is culturally relevant and appropriate, understanding that many tests were normed in a way that does not take into consideration Pacific Islander culture. And so lastly on this slide, which I know has been a lot, researching and understanding the impact that holding a bicultural identity is essential. So noticing how this could lead to identity strain, which impacts mental health and well-being, and further exploring these could be significantly impacted by today's movement. And so what I have here is just honing in more culturally regarding McCubbin and Marcella's research on Native Hawaiians. And so they show pro-social behaviors for resolution. And these could include humility and modesty, politeness and kindness, helpfulness, acceptance, hospitality and love, herbal treatments, purification baths, massage, special diets and fasting, confession and apology, dream interpretation, clairvoyance, prayer, transfer of thoughts, water blessings, and spirit mediumship. And I think that these can also include stuff like cultural dance, so hula, art, song, oli, all of those things that are really important and that allow you to connect with your cultural background are pro-social behaviors for resolution. And so I also want to take a moment to acknowledge that based on the personality that I have shared with you, that I take in my positionality, I believe that we as a community are the experts and are stronger together. And I say that intentionally because we specifically moves away from the American imperialistic point of view. And so I found it important to gather beliefs of other Indigenous folks and non-Indigenous practitioners to share with you all. Because I think just as important as it is for me to bring myself into this process, it's important for me to also bring in others. And I want to give them the space in the Kuleana to share their views on what others in the mental health field can learn from an Indigenous or Pacific Islander perspective. And I separate these ideas intentionally so that you can see what Indigenous clinicians find important, such as culture, an Indigenous worldview, and how non-Indigenous folks identify the need as understanding and increasing their cultural competency. And I think many of them align with what was previously shared, and I find this to be a beautiful full circle moment across different communities that we have here. And so I'll just hold for a second, so if anyone is interested in reading these and leaning into them a little bit more. And just an open-ended question that I have for everyone here is I want to know if there's anything in your respective cultures that you think that the mental health field could benefit from knowing. And if there is, you can drop it in the chat or you can unmute, whatever feels best. All right. And so I'd like to end with two Alelo No'iaus that I think are pretty accurate for our time here today. And the first one is Makahana Ka'ike, Maka'ike Kamana. So in the work there is knowledge, in the knowledge there is power. And the last one is Aohe Pau Ka'ike Ika Halau Ho'okahi. All knowledge is not taught in the same school. And I think that that's really important as I personally reflect on this conference and what I've learned from myself and how humbled I've been by all of you folks here today and your vulnerability, especially yesterday too. And so I think that that's just something really nice to kind of end on. So yeah, that is my presentation. Mahalo everyone for attending and for engaging.
Thank you so much, Melissa. What an amazing presentation. And I think for right now, I really would like to open it up to any questions that anyone might have for Melissa, or even any comments or just some talanoa if anybody is feeling inspired to just talk. But it does look like, Melissa, there are individuals who are interested in the copy of your slide deck.
Yeah, definitely.
And honestly, there was a lot in there to process, and I wonder if that might be why folks are a little, you know, not really talkative at this point.
It's early too.
Yeah. So Retta has a question. Presenting to those outside of the Pacific, how was it received or accepted? So if any of the information that was included in your presentation today, if you've presented to non-Pacific Islanders,
Yeah.
And what is kind of the sort of response that you received?
Ooh, that is such a great question. And so I have done several iterations of different like Pacific Islander presentations to folks that I work with, to non-Pacific Islander individuals, and I have received resounding positive information. And the first word I wanted to think of was silence, because it's a lot to take in. And so it's not silence in a bad way, but silence in a way of like that, oh shoot, I never knew this kind of moment, where folks were really shocked and angered at their education system, that they did not receive any of the information about any colonization happening within the Pacific Islander communities, or even any discussion or integration about their views of healing or their views of traditional ways of knowing. And so I've been met with a lot of water from the eyes, ocean from the eyes, a lot of want to learn more and to become an ally, because I do think that this is a community that often gets swept under the rug. And I think that it shouldn't be that way. And I think for me, what I find upsetting is that we need more people here to talk and to share their ike and mana'o to other people, so that we can decrease that gap of lack of knowledge, because there has been an overall almost erasure or just silencing of many of our cultures. So from a lot of the non-Pacific Islander folks that I have presented to, I have received a lot of sadness, grief, frustration, anger, want to do more or to know more. And it's been a reflective process for me to see folks actually going out and buying, Pacific Islander books and resources, and contacting people to learn more. Because I do think that, we can only do the work that we can do, and it's up to other people to also do the work, so that we're not all holding the burden of sharing some of this historical trauma. And then I've also shared some of this information with the Native American communities that I work with. And that has been a very collective and almost soul to soul just process of, even if they didn't know, they could understand, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Another question, how do you start to help youth navigate between two different cultures that can feel they go against each other? Feeling they don't belong in one culture or another because of it. Not white enough to and not Indian enough. Right. So that intersection of culture, and I can absolutely relate to that question when there's first and second generation young people who are Pacific Islander descent who struggle with that, right? And not really settling into their identity until they're much older. So maybe you can speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful question. And I think that that's actually so needed, because I do wonder if a lot of that disconnect, right, could lead to almost rejection, I guess, in a sense, where it's like, well, I don't understand both, or I don't know how I fit in both, so I just won't. And I think that that can cause a lot of disharmony too. But I do think for me, so when I think about it, I guess therapeutically, I think about holding a lot of space. And as I'm sure you all noticed today, I hold a lot of space just because I like for people to reflect. I like for people to kind of even if no one has anything to say, think about it, turn over it, because it could lead and make breadcrumbs to a later process of like, oh yeah, maybe that's right. Maybe that's something to think about. But for me, I kind of think of this concept of stage of change that we use in therapy, where it's like, are you in pre-contemplation? Are you in contemplation? Are you in action? Are you in maintenance? I know that's a very therapeutic term, but I think about that regarding like racial identity development too. So where are you on the continuancy of racial identity development? Are you ready? Because it can be really difficult to push folks who aren't ready. And then that can lead to more resistance too. But I think just leaving open space, having open conversations about it, depending on who these people are, if they're clients, if they're children, if they're family. I use within my own family, just, you know, I'll send books to my siblings about like, oh, this is really important in our culture, when I know that their racial identity may not be at the spot where mine is currently. And I just keep trying until, and I don't push, but I just say, you know, maybe this would be interesting. I found this really helpful. And I share pretty openly and pretty vulnerably my own experiences with folks about really struggling with my racial identity development. And I think there's something about coming together collectively and having those discussions to know you're not alone. Because I think a piece in there is that loneliness aspect where it's like, okay, I'm not white enough, I'm not Indian enough, like Lenora said in the chat. And for me, it was, okay, I'm not white enough, I'm not Hawaiian enough. And that piece of enough is just so powerful. And I think reframing that word in a way where like we all are enough and we all are here. But I think understanding like what does enough mean to you is huge too. And I also think that we can continue to engage in both levels of bicultural identity if that's something that you hold, and have love for all of them, and to just continue to send love out there. But I think it is tricky depending on if folks are resistant to that